I remember actually walking into Rabbi Schiller's office a number of years ago, and there was a bottle of whiskey on the shelf. And he told me that occasionally, if there's a siyum or something like that, then he will have a l'chaim with students. But then he shared with all the students that we'd brought from the JLE and were crammed into his small office in Ar Sameach. He said, when you drink a l'chaim, this was age 12 years, he said, think about the fact that this bottle has been sitting here and contains liquid that has been waiting for 12 years to be drunk. Just give it that chashivas when you say Sha'akol Ni'evet Dvarim. So I think as we stand here on Rosh Chodesh, where we can't have Hespedim, but we are reflecting back on the Rosh Hashiva's impact over his life, to really the fact that we take that time, in his own words, was to contemplate what over a lifetime, what it produced, and what over our lifetimes it can produce, and perhaps that was the l'chaim that he meant. Chazal say that when Moshe Rabbeinu was niftar, chaval al da'avdin v'lo mishtakchin, that woe to us who cannot replace the loss that sometimes befalls us when tzaddikim pass away. But then the Medrash continues and says, tzaddikim doimim lebayram, that tzaddikim have a comparison to their creator, because tzaddikim afilu b'misosa nikroin chaim, that there's something that continues to live on in the same way Sefer Torah continues to live on. The teachings of a tzaddik and a gadol such as the Rosh Hashiva continue to live on. So as we listen to the words of inspiration and Divrei Chizuk today, we're reminding ourselves not just what it means to live a life of Torah, but to live that life of Torah as a true Adam Gadol in the most beautiful form. Thank you.
So we're here to speak a bit about Rav Schiller, myself and Rabbi Sinclair and Rabbi Kirsch, and perhaps not a formal hesped, but actually to try to sum up in a way his life, maybe his ideals. Rabbeinu Bechaya says when it comes to Avram saying a hesped for his wife Sarah, that the purpose of a hesped, again, we're not making formal hespedim, but the purpose of this sort of event is to sum up a person's life. That's what he says. He knows you can't sum up someone's life, but what he means is that you try to identify the lines of energy, the defining characteristics of a person, and he says the reason you do that is so you know what you've lost. Obviously that means to know what you've lost, what you can learn from the person, and therefore it is an effort one has to make to sum up a person in some way. So Schiller, again, too rich and complex a person to really sum up, but some of the main themes that come to mind, and perhaps the other two speakers will fill in, and there are people in this room who knew him perhaps better than I did in certain phases. I'm going back to the former years. I've been in England for many years, and so I had less connection with him over the last few decades. But I think that two areas to speak about in general. One is who he was as a person, and more importantly, what he stood for and what his ideals were. The two aspects of people are, one is who they are, what they look like, and their natural talents and so on. We praise those less because those are gifts. It's really what a person does with those. But you need the background as well. Now, Schiller was a very strong person, very strong. He was physically strong and very commanding. He had a certain natural gravitas, even though he had a very mean sense of humor, or a wicked sense of humor sometimes, a very cutting sense of humor. Also a clever sense of humor, but never carried it with a certain gravitas. There was never anything flippant about him. So he was strong, he was physically strong, he had a leonine appearance, quite scary, could be, in fact. And he was also uncompromising, very, very, cut and dried principles, and would, at without a moment's hesitation, would give up big gains if there was any compromise at all. I think those were his natural talents. But more important about him is the things that he stood for in his ideology. And I think those perhaps break down into two main areas. One is his yeshiva building. That means the ideology of Torah education, particularly for those who didn't have a background. And the second was cultivating philanthropy, in other words, building it. Right? There were, if you walked into the yeshiva in the times when he and Rav Weinbach zt'l were running it, they had two different roles. And the more obvious one of Rosh Schiller's was building the infrastructure, as Rabbi Dov puts it. One was the Sarah Pnim, one was the Sarah Chutz. Right? Rabbi Schiller was really traveling all the time. Many times a month he would be, I think he probably owned half of the airline. the amount that he traveled. When he wasn't traveling, of course, he was sitting in his room, in his office learning. He had a person that he used to learn with, and the only break he took was a few minutes a day for lunch, which was vegetables, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Raw vegetables. That was lunch.
Salt.
No, absolutely no salt. And that's what he did. So the two areas are, first of all, the learning, and then we'll talk a little bit about his genius in philanthropy. And I don't like to use the word fundraising. It was a much richer experience than simply fundraising, although, of course, was fundraising too. So let's talk first a little bit about his ideology in building the yeshiva. The history is that in the years after the Six-Day War, that was when there was a tremendous surge of interest in tshuva. That's when the real, I think, the modern tshuva world as we know it today, the so-called Baal tshuva world, that really had its impetus beginning with 1967 war. And the 3 or 4 or 5 years after that is when things really began to move in the Israeli world and also in the English-speaking world. And what had happened at that time was that 4 uniquely talented individuals, that was Rav Weinbach and Rav Schiller, Rav Weinberg and Rabbi Rosenberg, were partners in an enterprise that changed the world. Believe it or not, it began in Bnei Brak. I don't know if you know that. It began in Bnei Brak. And Rav Weinberg at the time was the major sort of impetus behind sort of funding it. And he said to the others, he said, you want to back Baal Tshuva, it's going to be difficult enough, but in Bnei Brak it's going to be impossible. You want people to turn out the way we envision, that's not the place. It convinced them to come to Yerushalayim. And the 4 of them started a yeshiva, soon became called Shema Israel, with a very interesting publication that they put. They were all literary and poetic and literary types, so they had that flavor as well. Certainly knew how to speak to the modern ear. And they began that enterprise, which was reaching out to English-speaking. Later, of course, it became Spanish and Russian and Israeli and other branches as well. But at that time, it was reaching out to the more intellectual or the more intelligent travelers coming through Israel, prepared to hear that there might be something in exploring their heritage and learning Torah. And the story needs to be told in great detail at some point, how that foursome split up into its various factions. This is not perhaps the time to do it in detail, but a rough overview is that soon after they began, there was a very strong split in ideology about how Torah should be taught to newcomers. And the result was 3 major streams. Of course, Esher Torah became the one, with its own ideology and its own flavor, and Machon Shlomo became a different program with its own goals and flavor, and Osamer became what we know as Osamer. Let me try to put in a nutshell some of the differences in ideology. Again, it's not the time to go into it fully, but I think to understand Rav Schiller, you need to know what was the educational philosophy of Osamer and how it differed from the others, and how that became the legacy of what Osamer was. I'm not taking sides. I'm not taking sides here. Each of them, of course, became a great institution. Each of them attracted the talent in teaching that was appropriate for its own ethos, and of course reached out and brought in people who were appropriate to be absorbed in that ethos. But I would say the main difference of opinion, we won't talk now about Machon Shlomo and Machon Yaakov, but also Machon Esher Torah, the very big differences between them were that there was a very strong difference of opinion about what were the priorities and how should they be attained. Esher Torah's feel was that there was a life-saving job that needed to be done to save Jews. Torah learning is wonderful and primary, but there's something more urgent, and that is to save lives. The Rosh Hashiva used to say that how could you sleep at night when trains of Jews will be taken off to be gassed? And if you realized that, you'd be out on the street bringing Jews in. And the goal was to fire Jewish pride, Jewish marriage, found Jewish families, and the methodology was whatever worked. And they, of course, did an amazing job in forming that ideology and putting it out into the world. Osamer felt that a lot of that was not what they wanted to build. Rav Schiller, together with Rav Weinbach, felt that's not what they wanted to build. They wanted to build something that was founded solely and totally on Torah. Torah learning in the most conventional possible way, that Baal Tshuva should come into the world of Torah learning and as soon as possible be engaged in the conventional Israeli yeshiva mold. What we call mainstreaming people. Again, they knew that people need different handling when they're new, but nevertheless that was the goal. And so there were very sharp differences about a number of things. One was that they would not build the yeshiva on a charismatic personality. In other words, in contrast to the other institution, which was built around a very charismatic personality. Right? That was the whole appeal, that Rav Weinberg had this ability, a magnetic ability to draw people in and change their lives personally. They specifically avoided doing that. They didn't want that to be the attraction, even though they were enormous personalities. Rav Weinberg was a very, very dramatically literary and poetic person, or Schiller equally in his own way. They certainly could have done that. He used their potency and their gravitas and their charisma to do that. They didn't want to do that, and therefore they made sure that the presentation was always Torah first, and they'd be behind the scenes. So it wasn't one charismatic person, it was a team of extremely talented teachers. Extremely talented. Talented in Torah, genuine Torah. You could walk into Ohr Somayach at any time. The first person you might encounter was Rav Simcha Wasserman, teaching the beginners. Right? Doesn't get better than that. My own first teacher was Rav Schatz, an amazing Talmid Chacham. I mean, amazingly gifted. But again, not only gifted in conventional Torah teaching, but also in knowing how to do it. I'll tell you a story. Is when I began learning in Ohr Somayach, my brother-in-law and I, Dr. Rafael Bortz, both of us were doctors in Yerushalayim at the time, and the plan we came up with was, in order to fund ourselves, how would we support ourselves? The deal was, one of us would see the patients in the morning, and the other one would learn in yeshiva. Then we'd have lunch together and hand over the medical problems, and the other one would learn, the other one would do the medicine. And for years we were able to do that, so the first shiur that I had when I was in my learning phase in Shiva was Rav Schatz. And just to give you a little vignette, is one day we were learning Baba Basha, as it happens, and we were learning, and I asked a question. It was a pretty good question, I think. And he looked at me, had penetrating eyes, Rav Schatz, and he said, I think that's the kind of question that Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman would ask. Now, he knew, my family cousins were the Elchanan Wasserman's family. So he knew how meaningful that would be. And sure enough, he went to the shelf and he pulled and there was my question, right? And to this day, I'm in Torah learning because, I asked Rabbi Elchanan's question, and he knew exactly how to move a young man in a very personal way. So, but it wasn't only him. Rav Aaron Feldman was teaching. He wasn't officially part of the Hanola, but he was giving a Mishlei shiur. Among other things, I used to go and ask him my questions. We had a lot of weird questions, as you can imagine, in a Kiruv environment. We had all sorts of people. We had people walking in. I remember one German boy walked in telling us that his father told him the week before that he was Jewish. His father died the week before, and he said, "Before I die, you ought to know that you're Jewish." And the young fellow arrived the next week to say, "What does this mean?" And many people in Ohr Somayach had fascinating stories, each one more unusual than the. In fact, one of the unique features of Ohr Somayach was they decided they needed a Rosh Yeshiva themselves, even though they were fully capable. And Rav Schwartzman was the Rosh Yeshiva they used to look to. And for the most difficult and complex Gerus questions and bizarre, quite bizarre questions that come up in the world of Kiruv, he was the person they went to. So again, not that they were putting themselves forward, but Das Torah would run the enterprise. And so Rav Feldman, if I remember correctly, his Mishnah shiur, Yaakov, maybe you can correct me, I think it was on a Motzei Shabbos, just when the buses started running. Or maybe when you were there, it was? It was Motzei Shabbos, and he deliberately gave the Mishnah shiur when the buses started running. So you had to make a choice. You were either going to the nightlife of Yerushalayim, or you were going to come and learn Mishnah V'Am. That was the kind of stark reality you were faced with. And then there was Rav Karlebach, and later Rabbi with somebody talking about Rav Gottlieb, who was handling the introductory, more philosophical program, talking about heavyweights in learning, and the ideologies was to get people into it. So it was not a charismatic approach, it was Torah. It was conventional, not, there were no mixed men and women's tours or groups. They would never use somebody who was a media personality to be a sort of for publicity, right? It was always, and there were sacrifices to be made when you kept things that, let's call it narrow, but they wanted the field to be a conventional yeshiva field. And there were other differences as well. Eshet Torah decided the educational philosophy was to take a young man and put him through the routine that a young person would go through. First he learned Chumash, and some months later he'd start learning Mishnah. He wouldn't see Gemara for a year and a half. And Ohr Somayach decided it was not appropriate for someone who's 25 years old with intellectual background. So their philosophy was to teach throw him into the deep end of Gemara, although he had no basic skills, and then gradually catch up as time went by the basic skills as well. Two valid ideologies, but very different. And so the field that Rabbi Schiller and Rav Weinbach built together was a yeshiva that would be founded on pure solid Torah learning, and that people would go out into the, where possible, let's call it the mainstream, and be able to hold their own in that world. Part of the success was due to their partnership, which is really an astounding, remarkable thing. Both Rav Weinbach and Rav Schiller, both extremely strong personalities, very opinionated in a positive way, very strong. People uncompromising. When the original split took place, there was no hesitation about splitting, and it was a very strong split. And yet the two of them had a partnership that was nothing short of astounding. I used to see them functioning together. While one was speaking, the other one wouldn't even move, let alone voice any disagreement. Each one a master of his own area, complete, I would say, self-negation to the other in their respective areas. For such strong personalities, a remarkable thing to see. And that, I think, gives a little bit of a feel of what they were building. So the one hand was the yeshiva building with his unique personality and approach and educational philosophy. He himself gave masterful shiurim. He had a very weighty, even though he could be saying something light, but he had a certain presence when he would teach. He had a unique love for Meshech Chochmah, and many of you, perhaps most of them, maybe even all, were based on an idea that the Meshech was a master of Meshech Chochmah, and he used that to found or to base his educational, the whole stream of his educational thinking was based on that. In fact, that's why the yeshiva is called Or Sameach. I think Rav Weinbach once told me that because Or Sameach never had children, so they decided to call the yeshiva by that name, and that would be, so to speak, his children. The kollel that began then was called the Meshech Chochmah. I had the honor of learning in that kollel as well. What was unusual about the kollel? It was a formal kollel, but the deal was 1 hour a day you had to go and learn with someone new. So it was a formal Yerushalmi type, full-on kollel. And 1 hour a day, the last hour, second Seder, you went down into the base medrash, you learned with somebody who's an American boy, just walked in, or somebody, the first person they gave me was a Yale philosophy student who'd been meditating in the Sinai. And we started talking about Kabbalah, and that became a little group, and eventually that became a whole theme. But that was the style. He also had a sense of humor. I remember him once saying that in his youth, he was slugging it out in the street against some non-Jews that attacked him and his friends. They got into fights in the Bronx on the streets, and he was a strong individual, and I'm sure they were entertaining those fights. And he said once he was slugging it out with one or two of his friends, the punches were being thrown in both directions, and one of his friends said to him, Rabbi, you always tell us there's something you can learn from every situation. What can we learn from this situation? What spiritual message? He said, from this we can learn it is more blessed to give than to receive. That's what he said. But that was his. He also had a unique way of putting things. One fundraising dinner, which was attended by the rich and famous, where the yeshiva would be a major fundraising effort. His appeal was, he said, I'm not going to give a speech this year, I'm going to teach you halacha. Halacha is, many of the people assembled didn't have much Torah background, although certainly were warmly disposed. He said, there's a law that when two litigants appear in a Beis Din, they both need to be dressed the same. That's the law. If you're well dressed and you have a court case, a litigation with somebody who looks a bit more shabby than you, the judges may be influenced, and therefore you have to dress down like him or have to buy him a suit like yours. That's the law. He said some people look down on the yeshiva world and they denigrate the yeshiva world and they think it's, what are its achievements and can it be compared to the great intellectual institutions of the world? And then in a thunderous voice he said, you want to judge the yeshivas, dress them like the Harvards and Yales of the world. You give them the millions of dollars of endowments and bequests that they have, and you make them look like those institutions, those august institutions of education around the world, and then you judge the intellectual content of the yeshivas. Huh? That was the speech, and of course the donations flowed. So that was one area of his personality and his teaching. The other, of course, was a genius for philanthropy. It's hard to put this across because perhaps one hears this as fundraising, but it was much broader than fundraising. He cultivated a relationship with people in such a way that they became major supporters, but they became major people in their own right. One of the most striking examples probably is the Tannenbaum family. You see, Yaakov today is a product of that generations come out of that. it wasn't simply cultivating somebody who could give in a big way to the yeshiva. It was cultivating somebody to become part of that. Built him into a person, into the person that he was. A literally mutual relationship of growth. And he was very creative about it. He had a unique way with a spark and a sparkle. How many times were we invited to a lunch in the yeshiva? You remember those days we were invited to lunch in the yeshiva where some dignitary would be visiting? It might be the head of the Israeli army, or it might be some wealthy American, or somebody who had more or less contact with his Judaism. They'd seat him in the boardroom, quite a modest boardroom, feed him a lunch that was cooked in the yeshiva, and then after perhaps a few drinks and more relaxing sort of breaking the ice, we would be trooped in, a number of us, maybe 6 or 7 of these students, would be trooped in to tell our stories. And each of us had a more fascinating story than the next. There were professors of all sorts of things that have given it up. There was Nati Gamedze, a Swazi prince, right, who was a master, spoke 7 languages fluently, who now teaches Aramaic grammar as his specialty, by the way. A Swazi prince who converted and came in. He would tell his story. By the time the guest left, he would be, just like swaying with the power of the very disparate elements that had been drawn together in that. Of course, there were those who'd been meditating in cults in California. There were Israeli fighter pilots. There were, you name it. They were all in the yeshiva together. So that was, and of course, Schiller had he was a masterful choreographer. You know how to put those things together to have the maximum effect. I'll tell you one story. Just because this is being recorded, I need to be a little circumspect. I'm not going to tell you all the details. You can speak to me privately, I'll tell you the details. I'll just tell you one that I think perhaps illustrates this. I'm just giving you a sketchy outline of the story. There was a major Israeli politician, nameless for now, major top-level Israeli politician, who was an individual whose father had been a major Torah authority in his generation. And this generation had lapsed, and he'd gone into politics and had been very, very successful in politics. A major leader in the Israeli scene. And once this man, unfortunately, made a very disparaging comment about Osamech and got picked up by the news. He said he believes that in Osamech Yeshiva they burn kippot srugot. That's what he said. The Rabbi of Rehovot was Rabbi Cook at the time, got very upset about it, and he publicly challenged this individual. He said, "You're going to say things like that show such an abject lack of knowledge. You ought to visit the yeshiva and see what they're doing." And of course he couldn't refuse. And I was there that day, the state visit. And of course Rav Schiller knew exactly how to handle it. So here's this individual, arrived with the entourage and the TV cameras and the big lights, coming into this institution that he had publicly said is a totally mindless, primitive place. And of course, Rav Schiller invited everyone with at least a PhD, at least an MD or MD PhD. And that long base medrash was full of us. And they took him to the first table. This is Rabbi Professor David Gottlieb, he's Professor of Analytical Philosophy, and he's learning in Yeshiva. The next was 2 doctors from, and each one, they were, and he was getting paler and paler as he, it was being recorded for all posterity. This is the man who'd said it's a mindless institution. And of course, Rav Schiller made sure that each individual, not only fascinating stories, but highly academic. And then when, just to put the cherry on the cake, what they did was they had a reception. Every guest would be introduced to the yeshiva, perhaps have a lunch, and then there'd be a reception. The reception would be a speech or two, and then there'd be some special moving gift that the guest would be given, something particularly moving on an individual level. And as this dignitary sat in the reception, Rabbi Schiller presented him with a gift. The gift was, at that time in the Israeli division of the yeshiva, they had a very talented artist. This Israeli his specialty was drawing the most beautiful pictures, but with words. You know those pictures where you have, let's say, a scene from the Pesach Seder, and the words are the Haggadah. Or something from Megillah Esther, and the words are actually the Megillah. Rav Schiller had him draw a picture. It was a picture of his father, this dignitary's father, massive Talmid Chacham. And the words were a drosha of his father's on the importance of learning Torah. Right? Couldn't hold back the tears. So, that was the sort of personality, and he knew exactly where to, apply those punches. again, it wasn't only him. It was the team he built around him. Reuven Geffen, for example, a genius at knowing what's needed for each individual and running things. People like Rav Samet, Rav Isby. I mean, you could go on. Rav Malevsky. I mean, you're talking about people who were giants in their field. Rav Moshe Shapiro was giving shir in the yeshiva, right? Thursday nights, I walked down the steps one evening, and as a young Israeli fellow walking up the steps, completely secular individual, shaking, literally shaking, trembling. I said to him, "Where are you going?" He's going to see here Rav Moshe Shapiro. You know, he knew he was on his way to a life-changing. You know, Israelis, they do it all or nothing. He knew he was coming to hear this famed, and he knew he'd going to walk out of there different, and you could see that, So that was the atmosphere, and perhaps just to sum it up, Rabbi Schiller was also a poet, a very literary and poetic personality, and he wrote one poem I remember in which he called the Jewish people God's stiff-necked people with rawhide skins. That was the poem. Right? That was the chorus, if you like, of the poem. And I think that says a lot about him too. Right? A person who was fierce in his attachment to his own particular education ideology, to the ideal of building a yeshiva that would do that, would take people in. He was totally convinced that people with zero background could be brought into mainstream Torah living and learning. And I think he succeeded in doing that. He was one of God's stiff-necked people with rawhide skins.
Rabbi Tatz mentioned Reb Nota, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha's strength. And I remember one Yom Kippur, after everything's finished and the final shofar blast, so the Rosh Yeshiva gathered together and they danced around the bima. And for some reason I was sort of in that place of the queue where Reb Mendel hadn't yet arrived and Reb Pindrus hadn't arrived and so he pulled me into the center, and for a few moments together we were just dancing together. And as Rabbi Tatz said, the strength that emanated from the way he danced was this, the feeling of power that came from him was tangible. In every sense, Reb Nota was an Odom Gadol. Reb Moshe Shapiro used to teach us the word Gadol and the word Katan. Katan, small, comes from the Aramaic, is linked to the Aramaic katua, cut, which is actually the English word we have, cut. Why? Because Katan, you give a baby a popsicle, you give him a nice lolly, and he's the happiest person in the world. Take it away, the world has just come to an end. The definition of a katan is somebody who's not able to transfer, to move forward, to understand that this moment is connected to the next moment and the moment after that. Gadol comes from Gad, Gudud, Yigudenu. Gad is a marching troop. In modern Hebrew, the word Gudud is a platoon. The idea of a platoon is that which goes forward, meaning a Gadol. Somebody who is a Gadol is somebody who is able to take all of the disparate moments of his life and bring them into a single, cogent, coherent direction. Nothing goes atzida, nothing goes to the side. I think of the privilege that I've had of meeting people, Anashim Gadolim. This is a common link in all of them. And Reb Nota had this in spades. He was absolutely, totally focused on his life mission, which he believed to 100%, and nothing he did went to the side. We live in an era of defocus. We're taught, the whole of the media teaches a person not to be able to focus for more than a couple of seconds. And an Odom Gadol has this ability to take everything he does, and it's all focused, it's all planned. Nothing is going to the side. It's difficult for us, in retrospect, to realize how great a revolution Reb Nota and his partners, as Rabbi Tatz mentioned, effected. In retrospect, it's impossible to understand that in the early 70s, the idea of a Baal Tshuva revolution or a Baal Tshuva yeshiva was literally meshuggah. The gulf between the secular world and the religious world was, on both sides, I think, like two camps looking at each other across this broad, fast-flowing river, and never the twain will meet. It was something that we forget. And these visionaries, and Reb Notter amongst them, created something which is something yesh me'ayin. It's interesting, I've just remembered now that Rabbi Akiva Tatz here told me, I had a story, the same story you already told us about the dressing a poor man up as a rich man. And I thought, okay, let's cross that one out. But it reminded me of another story Reb Notter told us, which was that he said, when I was going to speak in America, I started to get invitations to speak. So he said, I'll give you a word of advice. If somebody starts to walk into the room who's heard your speech before, tell him the following story. He said, once there was this speaker, and he was speaking in Manhattan, and he goes next night, he's speaking in Flatbush, and he sees there's some guy who was at the previous night of the speech. So quickly on the spot, he changes the whole thing around and comes up with a totally new drosha. So the guy comes up to him after the speech and said, Rabbi, that was very, very good, but I was kind of disappointed because I heard you last night. I was hoping you were going to say the same thing again. So I'm not going to repeat Rabbi Akiva's story, but it certainly reminded me of that advice that I heard from Reb Notter. So, Baruch Hashem, we're here in the JLE, and I guess I want to say a personal thanks to Rabbi Kirsch here because he's part of my story too. I don't know if you remember this, but I used to come and daven here and used to take me back, and the Rebbitzins cornflakes would feed me breakfast. So it's a great schus to be able to see, many years later what this has come to. And it's an introduction to a story that Reb Notter told about one of the times he spoke here in the JLE. So you probably remember this. Everybody turned up for Shacharis on a Shabbos morning, and the guard didn't turn up. No guard, so everybody's waiting there. Half an hour goes past, 45 minutes goes past, an hour goes by. Finally, the guard turns up. And of course, then the latecomers arrive. So Reb Notter gets up to say his drosh, and he says, I want to apologize to all of you, those who thought that by the time you arrived here, you would have missed the drosha. But I want to tell you, at Or Sameach, however late you are, you're always on time. Rabbi Tat said he had the way of being able to take the moment and find exactly the right way of expressing it. So, if you've been to Or Sameach, I think we've all been to Or Sameach here, part of Or Sameach, you know that the street next door to Or Sameach is called W.F. Albright. Now, W.F. Albright was a Semitic scholar, a non-Jew, who was a big mumche in Semitic languages, and he was a professor, I think, at Johns Hopkins University, which was in the same town as Nei Israel, where Reb Notter learned. So the story goes that W.F. Albright walked into the base medrash one day, and he pulled aside one of the bochrim, it may have been my Notter, I don't know. He pulled him aside and said, look, I'm a Semitic language expert. I know every word on this page. I know the etymology of every word on this page. What's it saying? And Reb Notter tells the story of the poacher. There was a poacher who was fishing one night in the middle of the night, and the gamekeeper comes over, and he, with his torch, and he shines the torch in his face, says, what are you doing? He said, what do you mean, what's the problem? He says, this is a private pool. What are you doing here? He said, what are you talking about? Look at the sign, says the poacher. It says, sorry, so the gamekeeper says, can't you read? Look what it says over here. It says, no fishing allowed. So the poacher goes, no. It says, no fishing allowed. This was Reb Notter's moshel for learning the Gemara. If you don't have a Rebbe, if you don't go to a shiva, if you don't know where to put the commas in, where to put the question marks in, you're going to be lost. You might be W.F. Albright, but you're going to have no idea what's pshat. He used to speak a lot about an English writer called Maurice Samuel and a book called The Gentleman and the Jew. And he contrasted the idea of Edom and the idea of Yaakov in the scene in Bereshis where after Noach has been, whatever Torah says happened by his son Ham. So Yefes and Shem have to cover him up. And he says the difference in attitude was that Shem's attitude was this is something which is aesthetically unacceptable. But Etzem, it's the office. It's a problem of the way it looks from the outside. Shame is the ikka. The shame of something is its essence. And in essence, this was something that cannot happen. The gentleman, the Jew. Rabbi Nota was like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. But that fortune was a fortune in the world of truth. And really, as we stand here and we remember him, we've come to the end of an era. It's the end of an era. Reb Mendel Weinbach zt'l, Reb Dov Schwarzman, Reb Moshe Shapiro, Reb Moshe Karlbach, Simcha Wasserman, Reb Nachman Buhlman, Reb Bodl Chaim Tov, Reb Aaron Feldman, Reb Naftali Kaplan, Reb Samet, Reb Breitowitz, Reb David Gottlieb. It's invidious to start listing names because inevitably you're going to forget somebody. But the list, Reb Nota put together the dream team. And his godless was, and Reb Mendel too, was that they were able to draw out the individual talent of each particular person. Reb David Gottlieb said that this has been in Nosamech, that sometimes that in the yeshiva you have certain things that need to be taught, and so you hire the teachers who are going to be able to teach what it needs to be taught. So Reb Mendel and Reb Nota went the other way around. They found talented people, and they let them go. They let them do whatever they could. They gave them all the scope that they could have. And I believe this was because of two things. First of all, they were both very great people, but very humble in their own ways. And also, because they were so strong, they never felt threatened by anybody else's abilities. And when somebody feels like that, you can do whatever you like, and they gave all of us, I think, such scope. I remember walking at a certain period in my life, I became very interested in photography. And I remember walking into Reb Mendel's office and plonking this photograph down in front of him. He sort of looks down and he picks it up. And I explained to him, I've got this idea that for a book which combines black and white fine art photography and poetry and divrei Torah. And he sort of looked at the picture and lo and behold, Reb Nota comes, he says, I found a sponsor for your book. Now that to me is like amazing that a place like Or Sameach can foster that kind of creativity. The secular world seems to think of us as like straight in a straitjacket, but that's so untrue about Or Sameach. I'm sure everybody has that story. I remember somewhat later on as well, I decided I want to put together a band. I was in the music business many years ago. So I put together this, I guess you'd call it an electric band called the Orchestra, OAHR. And we had our first gig, our first performance, I think, and Reb Nota was there, and I came up to him afterwards. He came over to me afterwards, and he said, Yaakov Osher, what can I say? So I'm not sure exactly what he meant by that. But anyway. He loved jokes, as Rabbi Kiva was saying. Loved jokes. We used to go swimming together in the Beit Chinuch Ivrim. And he used to come up to me afterwards and he'd say, I'll see you later in the Sea of Talmud. Talking about swimming, apparently he, as Rabbi Tatz was saying, he spent most of his time traveling extensively in the States. And he stayed with this Gevir, who was very wealthy. And this Gevir had this exercise pool. And if you don't know what an exercise pool is, basically it's like a big tank with water being pressure blown at you. So you swim. So this Gevir asked Reb Nota what he thought of the pool. He said, well, it reminds me a lot of fundraising. You swim very hard and you don't seem to be getting very far. That was his humor. Yeah. Also, I remember he loved Borscht Belt comedians. I think one of his favorite one was Henny Youngman. And Henny Youngman said, there's no such thing as an old joke, just old audiences. And Reb Nota knew his audience. Reb Nota would be able to switch from being at a vort for Baal Tshuva and his Kala, with of course all the parents there who were secular, and he would start off with something like a line from Henny Youngman. But Henny Youngman somehow metaphors into a deep idea from Rashi. And this was the same Reb Notter who could speak for hours on Tisha B'Av. 3 hours he would stand there. And the ideas and his love and his pain for Klal Yisrael, it was mesmerizing. There's another story he used to tell about Red Skelton, an American comedian. So Red Skelton had one of the Red Skelton's characters was this lush, this perpetual drunk. And one day his wife had had enough with all this behavior. So what she did was she got a handyman in, and she got the handyman to nail all the furniture to the wall. Everything, the table, the armchair, the breakfast table, right, stuck down this sort of fried egg, all 90 degrees. So this lush sort of comes back home, and he goes, and with great effort he manages to clamber up into this armchair, and he's sitting there at the breakfast table, and he's standing there for like 90 degrees. And his wife comes in, and he turns to his wife and he says, "When you sober up, you can get down and join me for breakfast." And he used to say, "The world thinks that we're off the wall, but we know who's drunk and who's sober." He would take a story of Red Skelton, and he would... We're coming up to Pesach. I was thinking actually it was now Ben Moshe's Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Hakomasa, a Mishkan. Reb Notter set up a Mishkan in our own generation. He used to talk about Pesach. One of the things I remember he talked about Pesach was the idea of four. Everything about Pesach is four. 4 cups, 4 sons, 4 Maimorim, the Abba Lashonis of Geula, 4. And he used to point out that of all the festivals, Pesach is the last one to go, to be crossed off the list of a secular Jew. That's the last one to go. Shavuos goes first. Shavuos goes for why? Because what is there about Shavuos apart from cheesecake? In point of fact, the Zohar says Shavuos is the actual center of all of the festivals. And that's why it's Pesach has 7 days, Sukkot has 8 days. The further you get from the center of something, the more expansion there is. The absolute center of something takes up no space. And he says, were it not for the fact that Shavuos is a Yom Tov, and therefore it has to have Dinei Yom Tov. But in its essence, Shavuos is a point which vanishes into infinity. It's the connection, our connection to infinity. But of course, to somebody it has no visible mitzvahs. That goes first. And then Sukkot goes first. And then, last of all, is Pesach. In America, they have something called the Maxwell House Haggadah. Do you know about this?
Still got them.
Still got them. So every Jewish home, however secular, has a Maxwell House Haggadah. Why is that? So Rabbi Notter pointed out, he used to bring the pasuk, Shema b'ni Musa avicha, va'al titosh Toras imecha. Shema b'ni Musacha. You have to actively listen to the Musa of your avicha. There are 3 avos. You've got to listen. Va'al titosh Toras imecha. Don't uproot the Torah of your mother. He used to say, the Toras imecha is, Pesach is imoisdik. It comes down in your mother's milk. It's there. And all you need to do is to not uproot it. And for that reason, that's the last stop. There's a story, Rav Notter was well known, not just amongst the Gevirim, but also amongst politicians. He had a friendship with Shimon Peretz. And there's a story that goes that Shimon Peretz, at that point, everybody was complaining about the Haredim taking over the government. And Rav Notter was business class, and it happened that there was a spare seat up in the first class. So they bumped him up to first class, 1A. He walks up to the front of the plane, and lo and behold, there's Shimon Peretz sitting in his seat. So he says, Shimon, you can keep your seat. Just next time you're in the Knesset, please don't complain about Haredim taking your seats. There's an interesting personal note that I'd like to add here. that my wife is from Argentina, and we got engaged on the day that the British, the English, and the Argentinians signed a peace treaty. And Reb Nota pulled out a chazal. He says there's a chazal, I didn't find it before, I think it's a medrash, that says that Shlomo HaMelech was able to grow plants that normally only grow in Africa, right in Yerushalayim, in the middle of Yerushalayim. Why was that? Because the hashpah for everything that can exist in this world comes down through the Makom HaMikdash, and it spreads out like cables of power lines to keep. So the Chochem Mikol Odom understood where of all of these places it would be possible to grow some exotic cactus that would only flower in the desert in South America. He said, because you two are getting engaged tonight, that's the koyach that it gives the English and the Argentinians to be able to make peace. Yeah. Rabbi Tatz mentioned he had a chavrusa. And the chavrusa's name was Rav Yossel Zeinvert, Sefer Zad Levrocha. It was an old Yerushalmi. And he once told us a beautiful story about the Ramban. The Ramban came to Eretz Israel where he couldn't even find a minyan in Yerushalayim. Had to go down to Beit Lechem, I think it was. It was so desolate here, it beggars the imagination. And the Talmidim wrote to the Ramban and says, what is the Rebbe doing in Eretz Israel? And he wrote back, Eretz Israel is like a beautiful woman who has many suitors. But of course, she can only marry one of them. So she devises a stratagem to be able to sort out the eligible suitors. What happens is when someone comes to woo her, to go out on a shidduch, her equerry ushers this fellow into an antechamber, and in front of him is some fruit and some sforim, Sifrei Kodesh, and he exits. Now, unbeknownst to him, the beautiful princess has a spyglass. She opens up this spy thing in the wall and she watches him. Now, if he takes an apple, he makes a nice bracha. If he picks up a sefer, and starts to learn. So she comes out wearing her most beautiful attire. But if he's, not worthy, sits there, doesn't do anything, just grabs an apple doesn't learn, so she'll come out with her teeth blackened, wearing her most ugly rags. Because Eretz Yisrael will never reject anybody. He will reject her, but it's really her rejecting him. And it's the same with Eretz Yisrael. When a person comes to Eretz Yisrael and he sees the beauty, he has this feeling of the Kedusha and the physical beauty of Eretz Yisrael. That's because Eretz Yisrael recognizes in him that he's Roy, he's fit. But if a person comes and he sees nothing but dumpsters, and then it's really Eretz Yisrael rejecting him. Because Eretz Yisrael will never reject a person outright. I want to just add something to something Rabbi Kiva said, how he used to have the Gevirim in, and he would kind of, so to speak, parade. He'd bring out all the people he felt were talented or interesting in order to curry favor with the Gevir. And I remember I was in a bit of a bad mood one day, and I sort of got a bit fed up with being paraded. And he brought me out, and about a minute into this conversation, I said, "Excuse me, I've got to go." Ooh, wow. And I thought, that would be it. He never mentioned a word. He was somebody who understood very, very clearly, very sympathetic. He understood I couldn't do it. And he never resented it. He never felt any way that he took it against me. And that to me was a measure of his gadlus. He had this ability to be moichel. I don't know what it cost him, but it certainly wasn't a great moment for Osameach. And he let it go. He let it go. My wife reminded me of something a story that, as much as he was a great speaker, he was a great listener. he once told us a story that he'd been speaking to this Gevir, and this basically what the whole conversation had been taking place with this Gevir was talking to him, and Rav Nota had been standing there, and he was going, So then this Gevir walked off and spoke to somebody else. Who have you been speaking to? This guy said, I've been speaking to Rabbi Nota Schiller. What a conversationalist. Yeah. Another story he used to tell us was, he was in a railway carriage, this fellow, and there's a newspaper with this from religious Jew, and it says, arrested for embezzlement. So the secular Jew turns to this religious Jew in this railway compartment, shows him the newspaper, and says, what do you say about this? So Rav Nota used to say, the problem was, under his beard, he was unshaven. And I often think that Rav Nota, when he would see somebody with dreadlocks, with hair down here, under the long hair, he saw the payas. As great as he was as a fundraiser, as great as he was as a speaker, his love for Klal Yisrael was unmatched. He loved Yidden. He loved Jews. He loved every Jew. Rav Nota is on video, you can find it, he's speaking, he says, there was a Gvir who told him that he was a dreamer. And he said, I prefer to think of myself as a visionary. He told us a story about the Ponevezher Rav. The Ponevezher Rav, when he came to Ponevezh was basically a few mud tracks and a couple of buildings, that was that. And he turned up and he said he was going to build a yeshiva for over 1,000 bochrim. People said, you're crazy. You're Meshuggah. He said, back in Ponevezh, there was this guy who went Meshuggah, and he went around smashing windows, taking windows out, smashing out. He said, I have a mishigas. My mishigas is to put windows in. Rav Nota said, that's my mishigas. I want to put windows in, and not only windows in one of the most beautiful Batei Medrash in Eretz Israel today. He put windows in thousands and thousands and thousands of Jewish homes. Yezichro Baruch.
It's an honor and a privilege to be speaking in this wonderful building. It's a particular honor and privilege to be speaking in front of a group of, I say this very politely, but old friends. And we have one thing in common, that we generationally connected in some way or another to Sameach. Some people even bring their children along with them to share with them the experience and the energy. And I want to share with you, if I can, from a personal perspective, some of my early interactions with Sameach in general and with Rabbi Schiller specifically, and to begin to open our eyes to the enormity of what's happened to the Jewish world over the last 60 years. Rabbi David Refson, when I was studying at the Hebrew University doing an ulpan, I went to him once for lunch because my sister was at Neve, and he says to me, what do you do all day? So I said, I'm learning Ivrit. To which he said to me, beyond learning Ivrit, what are you learning? I said, Holocaust studies and other things like this. He said, are you fulfilled? I said, well, not particularly, but I'm learning. He said, do you have any spare time? I said, yes. He says, well, meet me at the Givat Ram University at such and such a time. I'll take you and I'll help you to find some learning. So fine. So he drives me from Givat Ram and we drive up to Malot Daphna. He takes me into the Or Sameach office, and the first person I meet is Rabbi Weinberger. And he hears I'm from England. And in Or Sameach there was one English person in the yeshiva at the time, one English person at the time. So he picks up an American football and he throws it at me and says, "Catch, this is a football." And that was my introduction to yeshivas Or Sameach. The Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Schiller, had a fascination with baseball. Now, my education in England had been broad, but I rarely met any Rabbonim who threw American footballs at you, and where the Rosh Yeshiva would play baseball. In fact, he told me once that somebody once stopped him in Malot Daphne. It's now been built up, but opposite the yeshiva there was an open space, and during breaks people used to play a bit of football or basketball or baseball as well. And the Rosh Yeshiva of Olsameach, you have to realise 50, 60 years ago, gentlemen, ladies, this was like, wow. So the Rosh Yeshiva of Olsameach was playing baseball, and another Rosh Yeshiva came up to him and says, "Is it right for Rosh Yeshiva to play baseball?" And he said, "Only if he's good." Then he's allowed to play baseball. So when I entered into the world of Olsameach, I entered into a very American yeshiva, but part of what was a new, if I could put it politely, American revolution. I don't want to upset anybody about having tea in Boston or anything like that, but there was clearly an American revolution that was going on in Eretz Yisrael, spearheaded by the individuals who were mentioned beforehand, who had a view on trying to find a way to connect the old with the new into the old again. An ability and a desire to find a method to connect people to where they came from in truth by being able to speak the language of where they were at that time. Rabbi Schiller, Zichron Livrocha, had the most extraordinary, exquisite command of the English language. And I thought I could speak English relatively well. And I jumped forward a little bit to the first time when he asked me and my wife to run a Shabbaton in England about 1983. We came just for a Shabbos here. And we called, the event was called The Taste of Jerusalem. And we used Dunstan Road Shul. We ran a program and I produced a poster. And I showed him the poster. And he looked at the poster and he showed me where my spelling mistakes were in the poster. And where the grammar was a little bit incorrect, and where I should have put a hyphen or a code. We're not quite used to having a Rosh Yeshiva who plays baseball, who I believe has a doctorate in English literature and knew a vast amount in every possible area that you can possibly imagine. Yet was as stark and as yeshivas as you possibly can imagine. But that background allowed him to communicate with the people who he met. That background was an asset not to be flaunted, but to be used in a way to draw other people to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to his Torah. I remember, as part of this American Revolution, having gone from the Hebrew University and asked my parents at the time if I could have a year off from working for my father, because I wanted to go to Israel and do a course at Hebrew University, and then contacting them to say to them that I was actually in Yeshiva or Sameach, and I wanted to stay there rather than finish my year at university. They were a little bit unnerved. Because as part of the revolution, the word Olsameach was also getting some other names out as well. You see, if you're on the side of the revolution, you want the good guys to win. But if you're against the revolution, you have no idea of the negative press and the negative language which was used for people who were part of that world as well. And my parents got rather concerned. So they had a connection with an extraordinary rabbi called Rabbi Sassoon, Zichron Livrocha, who was very much part of the individual that impacted our family in our early stages. And they asked Rabbi Sassoon, could he please go and speak to this Rosh Yeshiva and try and find out about what this institution is all about? Is it true? It's brainwashing. What's happened to my boy? Like, he was supposed to be doing the, and now he's gone off to sit and learn. So they asked Rabbi Sassoon, himself an enormous scholar, Talmud Muvak of Rabbi Dessler, extraordinary individual, to go to meet the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Schiller, where he had an interview with the Rosh Yeshiva, and afterwards he sent back glowing reports to my parents, and I suppose that's why I'm here today. Afterwards, when I met Rabbi Schiller and spoke to him, I said to him, how was your meeting with Rabbi Sassoon? So he said to me, a gentleman and a scholar. And I've only found out recently, do you know that's a quote from a well-known American book? Do you know the book? Do you remember what it's? Okay, we'll talk about that later. This is the sort of personality you had, using the incredible history of culture, connection, wisdom, knowledge. He could disarm the greatest intellect because he knew their world better than them, and used as an entree to Yiddishkeit, an entree to Judaism. He was fond, as was mentioned beforehand, of saying that the students of Osamer were graduates of Yale, of Harvard, etc., etc. And he was also fond of making it very clear to these ex-Yale, Harvard students that they knew nothing. In a very nice and polite way, he would be telling them, that which you think you know, that which you think you understand, it's just the beginning. You start learning Gemara, you start learning Talmud, you start going into the depths of wisdom and knowledge, then you'll be able to understand and then you'll be able to learn. And you would have these philosophy graduates, great and wise and knowledgeable people from the world's best universities, who would come and start debating with him, and he would have the audacity to say to them, you don't know anything, what are you arguing about? You talk about the philosophy you're talking about, and you ridicule Judaism, but you don't know the Judaism you're ridiculing. And he would tell a lovely story about the famous Apikoros in Moscow. The Apikoros in Moscow, who people would go to study and find out and learn great wisdom from. And there was one individual who decided, I want to become an Apikoros as well. You know, Jews unfortunately were leaving the fold. They were involved in all sorts of the isms which were going on there. And they want to learn to challenge the basis of what Judaism stands for. And then from a home which keeps and commits themselves to Jewish tradition, but they want to become an Apikoros. So he's told, the real Apikoros, you want to learn by the best Apikoros, then you've got to go to Moscow and you'll find the world's top Apikoros. He's the person you have to go to. So he makes the long journey. They're committed and dedicated to go off by speaking to this Apikoros. Finally, he asks people, I'm looking for the Apikoros. Can you tell me where he is? He says, yeah, he's sitting in the back of the shul learning. Beg your pardon? Yes, yeah, he's sitting in the back of the shul learning, and that's the man you want to speak to. Anyway, so he goes in, he encounters the Apikoros, quite a seriously bearded individual, deeply engrossed in sugyas, and he goes up to him and says, excuse me, are you the Apikoros of Moscow? He says, yes. He says, I've come to learn with you. Will you teach me? I hear you're the person to tell me and explain to me. Will you explain everything to me so I can fight against my Judaism? So the Apikoros turns to him and says, tell me, what have you learned? He says, well, I've heard Nietzsche. And he starts quoting philosophy and telling all the information that he's learned. And he tells him the great works that he studied. He says, no. I want to know, what have you learned? What have you learned? He said, well, I'm not so good at Mishnayos. I never really liked it. But philosophy. So the Apikoros looks at him and says, right now you're an Am Ha'aretz. He says, if you want to become an Apikoros, you're going to have to learn for a long time first, and then you can become an Apikoros. And Rabbi Schiller would disarm people by saying to them, you want to learn, you want to study, then we can talk. But you're attacking Judaism, but you're not attacking it from a standpoint of Jewish wisdom and Jewish knowledge. Sit, learn, understand, and then we can do battle together. And that also brought a lot, we're talking about lots of friends, there are a lot of enemies. Or Sameach, when I went to yeshiva, there were a lot of people who were bad-mouthing it because it was up front, comfortably able to fight against the isms. And it wasn't embarrassed about fighting against the isms. And it would tell people, as it was, we disagree with you. Philosophically, we disagree with you, but we ask you to come in and learn and ask you to understand more and appreciate more. Now, we spoke beforehand about Rabbi Schiller's sense of humour and his ability to communicate. But as a speaker, I was thinking beforehand, I'd like to say I'd learned a lot from him because I did learn from him as a speaker, but I'm not sure that I've been successful in embodying it into my droshes. But as a speaker, he would use the humour as part of the depth of the drosha, which was mentioned beforehand. That's very clever. That's very, very clever. Because most people give a joke to get everybody liking them, and then they tell the Devar Torah or the idea that they want. He would never do that. It was always a case of everything was connected to everything else. If I'm going to tell you a joke, or I'm going to tell you a story, it has a deep, deep message within the story. I remember when he was talking to us once about this fact that knowledge and wisdom is such an essential part. Just as a quick segue, we don't realize the world of the past and how so many Jews 100 years ago left authentic Judaism. And how unusual this revolution that he was part of was, that people were now returning to Judaism. I remember my father-in-law, Zichron Livrocha, used to come into the JLE in his 90s and he used to say, like, this is amazing. When I was growing up, everybody was leaving Judaism and now they're pushing their way through the door to come and hear a Rabbi Tatz's lecture. Like, wow! Because the world they came from was a world where everybody was leaving. And those who'd left were often the greatest antagonists against those who once were. Unfortunately, they often created the biggest problems because they said, we've left it, and in their heart and in their mind, it would be beyond them to accept that actually maybe orthodoxy is right, because my family's made a conscientious decision to leave it. Rabbi Schiller was not embarrassed to face these issues face on. And I remember him once talking about the aspects of the world of Meir She'arim. Interesting. You know, we speak about fundraising, and I'm not getting into ideology of Zionism and working. That's not the issue here. The issue was very interesting. He was talking about fundraising, and he said to me, you know, I travel the world, the Gera asking for money, but I know that if I'm down to my last dime and I can't afford, I'm going to go to the poorest and the frummest yeshiva guys in the world, and they're going to look after me. They're going to care for me, because they truly understand the depths and the beauty of what it is I'm standing for, and they'll come with me as well. And I remember him telling a story once about the world of Geula Meir She'arim, which was literally over the road from the yeshiva. And he once told us the following. He said, you know, there was once an American tourist, a bit of a know-it-all, Balgaiva American tourist, walking through the streets of Meir She'arim, and a little yeshiva bocher, you know, 6, 7-year-old, who probably knew much more than this Balgaiva American tourist knew. This little American student said to Israeli yeshiva bocher, looked up and says, Rabbi, where's your couple? As you can imagine can happen. To which the Rabbi turned to him and says, the heavens are my couple! I don't need a couple, the heavens are my couple. To which the little boy turned to him and said, wow, such a big couple for such a little head. And then Rabbi Schiller went on to describe and explain to us that the world we live in, unfortunately, people have big heads, but they need to be filled with knowledge and wisdom. And the revolution that he set up together with Rabbi Weinbach, Zichron Livrocha, is a revolution of knowledge needs to be accessible to everyone. He would tell me very clearly, Osamer is a yeshiva, it's just a yeshiva for beginners. And what we want to do is to make it easier for people to enter, but we want to take the responsibility of connecting them with the Masorah. We want to connect them with their past. And I want the Graces Rosh Yeshiva to walk into this base of Medrash, feel, debate, discuss, argue with the Bochrim as if they were in a classic yeshiva. In fact, I remember the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, I think it was Rabbi Birnbaum, he would come to visit sometimes. He had family in Malot Daphna. And he came during one Ben Osmanim, and he was, walking around the yeshiva, loving it. And there was a boy from the Mir in New York, from Osmecha, wanted to get into the Mir of New York, and he had his for hair, and he got in. Top boy, got into the yeshiva. Anyway, in the first Mussar drosha that the Rosh Yeshiva gave when he was in the Mir in New York, his drosha was about the learning in Or Sameach. How the guys are steiging and they start from nothing, and I watched the dramatic change taking place. And the Rosh Yeshiva from around the world were mesmerized by watching how a boy could come into the yeshiva, and 2 or 3 years later they were in the top level. So this rather chutzpahdik bocher then came up to the Rosh Yeshiva and said, 1 second, I've come to this yeshiva to learn and to study, and you just told me that the best place in the world for learning was Or Sameach. That's where they really learn. And the Rosh Yeshiva said, don't worry, we can teach you lots here as well. And I remember Or Sameach created a post, an advertisement, which read, which yeshiva has Talmidim in Lakewood, Mir and Brisk? Now just think about that advertisement. Which yeshiva has Talmidim in Lakewood, Mir and Brisk? That was Or Sameach. Because they wanted it to be a starting place for people to mainstream into the yeshiva world, and they wanted people to believe that even though you started as a beginner, there's no end to what you can achieve in your life. I was learning a number of years ago Masechtas Nozir with a chavrusa, and I once told Rabbi Mendel Weinbach, Zichron Livrocha, that I was learning Masechtas Nozir, a hard Masechta to learn, no Rashi, difficult Masechta to learn. And Rabbi Weinbach says, I want to show you something. So he took out today's classical sefer on Nozir, and he says this sefer was written by a Talmud of Or Sameach, and now it's used worldwide for people who want to understand Nozir. It doesn't matter where you came from, it matters more where you want to get to. And we're going to create an environment, we're going to create a yeshiva which will do this. I remember speaking to Rabbi Mordechai Perlman, Zichron Livrocha, also one day, he was talking about him speaking to Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, when Or Sameach was first started, about whether he should take a job in Or Sameach or not. So Reb Chaim Shmulevitz said to him, look, tell me a little bit about this place. Is it yeshiva? He said, well, it is a yeshiva, but the guys turn up dressed the way they dress, and they don't have much knowledge and wisdom. But so Reb Chaim Shmulevitz says, tell me something. Do they learn Gemara? Yes, they learn Gemara. Is there dormitories? Yes, there's dormitories. Do they learn Musa? Yeah, they learn Musa. He says, then it's a yeshiva. The fact it's a yeshiva for beginners is not the point. It's a yeshiva. And Rabbi Schiller and Rabbi Weinbach's ideology was to create an environment where anybody could start, and then the sky's the limit. And I must say, I have seen over the last 45 years since I had the schus to walk into yeshiva, I've watched miracles take place. I've watched people transform themselves, transform their families, transform communities, and it all started by the ability to begin that learning journey in Or Sameach. And I've also watched an extraordinary cadre of people go into the world of work, confident that they can learn and work as well. Two little stories I want to share with you. We spoke a little bit about fundraising, and I've merited the opportunity to raise money over many, many years. And I was also pulled into one of these meetings when I was at Bocha. Just putting it in historical perspective, when you see the totality of what's happened in Israel since the founding of the state, and the changes that are happening in Israel, in terms of the religious, non-religious, the journey within the non-religious to religious, I picked up this book called Jerusalem Echoes, which was one of the fundraising magazines that they put together at different times. And in it there's an article called All By Myself. And All By Myself is the most fascinating article written by a secular Israeli describing, who is writing in a magazine called Haaretz, who's writing about what's happening to all of his friends who are becoming from. The most fascinating article which takes place. And within that as well, just to mention, I had the schus to meet along the journey some of these famous Israelis who were changing their lives and bothering the undercurrent of Israeli society with this as well. You know, when Uri Zohar becomes frum, or Pupik Arnon becomes frum, and some of these people, it really rattled the society. Anyway, Israel was famously a socialist country, and the government was socialist, and Menachem Begin comes to power in the 1970s, and things begin to change on lots of different levels. A much more proud, open Jew, much more right-wing approach to Israel. Things have changed dramatically since Menachem Begin became Prime Minister of Israel. And the government started talking about beginning possibly to start financially helping yeshivas. And I was there in a meeting where the head of various institutions from the Israeli government come in, and we were pulled out to, maybe you were in that meeting as well? And we're talking about potential big bucks for the yeshiva, and the yeshiva certainly needed big bucks at the time. So I went to Rabbi Schiller a day or two later, and I said, how was the meeting? Like, we were primed. We had to tell them what we're doing. This is high-level government officials who are talking about helping support a Torah institution, which is quite a modern phenomena. You should realize that in the history of Israel. So he said, no, I have to wait and see. I thought you're looking remarkably calm. Like, this is a big deal. You look remarkably calm. So he said to me as follows. He said, we have done ha'hishtadlus. We've done what we're supposed to do. Now we're going to see whether they've got the merits, the schus, to be the ones who are going to invest in the yeshiva. Now that is a different approach to fundraising than anybody ever imagined. I've done what I need to do. It's not whether you're going to part with the money. Let's see if you've got the merits that this is what you're going to invest us in. And I remember Reb Simcha Wasserman, Zeichel Tzadik Livrocha, once talking about the Chazal, which says that there's going to be 10 famines which are going to affect the Jewish people. And the last of them is Lo Rov Lelechem V'lo Tzoma L'mayim. The last one is a famine which is going to be so horrific, it's not going to be a hunger for food or thirst for water. Kim Lishmar Es Divrei Hashem, just to hear the words of Hashem. Says Reb Simcha, that's a famine? That's how somehow compared to Rus, or the famine that affected Avram Avinu, that's a famine? That's a person's dream. They'll be coming forward and they're going to be eating and enjoying and wanting water and hunger. They'll be... What sort of famine is that? So Reb Simcha, unfortunately, when people are really, really hungry, they eat rubbish. And they start going around the dustbins picking up potato peels. He says there's going to come a time where there's going to be such a famine for truth, such a famine to want to know what's honest, but sadly, a lot of people aren't going to be given the right thing and enjoying the right thing. To which he said, and my bracha is, that in Mitzvah Hashem, the people who are hungry and thirsty should turn up in Or Samech. Because then they're going to be fed food which will be nurturing the soul and nurturing the future generations. They're going to be given water and drink which allow them to become the people that they should become. Just want to finish also an extraordinary experience that I had in the early days of fundraising. As was pointed out beforehand, he had the ability to build long-term relationships with the people, of which when I went fundraising, I'm still living off those long-term relationships sometimes. There was one individual who I told recently that Rabbi Schiller passed away, and this individual said to me, the letters that he wrote to me, either asking me for money or thanking me for the money, were a piece of work. They were just extraordinary. It wasn't just, on behalf of the yeshiva, we would like to thank you for. No. It was a well thought out Devar Torah, a deep penetrating message, something for me personally, and he created the deepest of incredible relationships, which was helping that individual in their own spiritual growth as well. As if to say, I'm doing you a very big favor by allowing you to invest in Or Samech, and I'm helping you on your spiritual journey as well. And he believed in this with all of his heart and with all of his might and with all of his soul. He believed that the ability for us to take Torah wisdom, take Torah knowledge, and ensure that generations can return to previous generations, went through his life and went through his blood and lived his complete essence. I remember he once told me, he was very close to Rav Hutner. He told me once Rav Hutner, when he was going to live in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Hutner said to him the following words. He says, my bracha to you going to live in Eretz Yisrael, may your aliyah have a neshama. What a brilliant joke. Usually when somebody passes away, we say, may the neshama have an aliyah. He says, may your aliyah have a neshama. It's not appropriate because it's Nissan. It's not appropriate for us to give hespedim. But there's no doubt in my mind that the aliyah's neshama that he has created in the lives of thousands of people, because his aliyah had a neshama, and he was looking out from the neshamas of the Jews to give an aliyah to, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the power and energy which has been created is the beginning of a new revolution, which began 50, 60 years ago, and which behooves and obligates each one of us to continue. It's Hashem, we should be blessed that his memory should obligate us to keep building for the future. Maruf will be in 3 minutes' time. Thank you very much.